All right, welcome to the Week 6 Forum. I noted in the overview some of the general commonalities between liberation and green ideologies. For the forum, I thought I would offer brief mini lectures laying out one of the main liberation ideologies and then offer a similar mini lecture on some of the highlights of the green ideology. Liberation theology is a movement within the Catholic Church primarily that emerged in the 1960s. So this is an expressly religious movement most of whose adherents were practicing Catholics who found liberation theology most persuasive. Liberation theology is clearly a reformist movement that developed within the Latin American clergy of the 1950s and came sort of into fruition in the 1960s. It stands as a kind of synthesis of Christian theology and Marxist socioeconomic analysis. Biblically, there's a lot to draw on to advance the notion that the Catholic Church and Catholics at large have a duty to show a preference option for the poor, to use the phrase offered by a leading libertarian or liberation theologian, Gustavo Gutierrez. In addition to Exodus, wherein God is shown freeing the Israelites and showing a preference for the enslaved, there is also Luke 4:18, preach the gospel to the poor, heal the brokenhearted, set the captive free, offer sight to the blind, and liberate those who are oppressed. And then there's also Matthew 25:40, as you have done to the least of my brothers, you have done unto me. Not surprisingly, liberation theology provoked pretty sharp pushback within the Catholic Church. As Pope John Paul II was notably cool towards liberation theology. In the 1980s, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would become Pope Benedict XVI, and who was then the prefect of the Vatican's Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, otherwise known as the CDF, accused members of liberation theology like Gutierrez of politicizing church doctrine and converting it into Marxist mythology. The text shorthands Ratzinger's critique as an accusation that liberation theology has too much Marx and too little Jesus. At the same time, Benedict did acknowledge that the need behind liberation theology's call for justice for the poor. As Pope, Benedict did not speak out with particular force against liberation theology, and he took no active measures to suppress the teaching of liberation theology in Catholic churches throughout Latin America. With Benedict's surprise retirement, the Papal Enclave selected Argentinian Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who subsequently became Pope Francis. He was the first Jesuit Pope, the first Latin American Pope, and the first Pope selected from outside Europe since the 8th century AD. As a cardinal in the 1970s, Bergoglio was a critic of liberation theology. How has Pope Francis, look around, how has Pope Francis made his views on liberation theology known as Pope? Has he spoken out against it or for it? What is the liberation theology view of freedom? First, the agents are Christians, right, for the most part Catholics. The obstacles are sin in the form of oppression and indifference to the plight of the poor. And the goal, of course, is equal dignity for the poor and respect for social justice. Now, how we go about doing that, that the devil lies in the details. Let's move on to consider green ideology. The text authors characterize green ideology in many ways as a kind of counter-ideology. In what sense do the authors contend that green ideology is advanced as a critique of ideologies of both the left and the right? What problem in particular does green ideology have towards liberalism? Isn't liberalism an ideology largely sympathetic to environmental concerns? Most advocates of green ideology attempt to advance what they call a land ethic. What are the key elements of a land ethic if you're looking at the work of someone like Aldo Leopold? What role can science play in articulating a land ethic? What role potentially can religion play in informing a land ethic? What kinds of religions in particular does the text advance in support of the idea that religion can buttress the rationale for a land ethic? A central element of most green ideologies is the idea of conservation. Related to the notion of conservation is the criticism of particularly American tendencies towards profligacy and excessive consumption. To illustrate the problems created by consumption for consumption's sake, Kentucky environmentalist and farmer Wendell Berry is noted in the text as characterizing America's conspicuous consumption as a variety of intergenerational theft. Can you think of any examples that help to illustrate Berry's argument? Most environmentalists acknowledge that they confront a collective action problem. There are too many incentives for people to consume now and to consume selfishly, and too few environmentally woke people to form the nucleus for collective action. The authors cite an important essay called The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin to illustrate this collective action problem. Hardin uses the example of the enclosure movement in England and how the commons were used in the late feudal period as an example of how economic incentives can erode common rights and kind of consume what are otherwise public resources. One other common dimension of green ideology I wanted to discuss was the contrast between light and dark greens. Light greens are people like Wendell Berry, who are environmentalists who believe in conservation, but who are, believe that human beings have a right and indeed a duty to cultivate the land and to develop a connection with the land. A good illustration of the light green approach is the idea of sustainable farming. Dark greens, on the other hand, criticize light greens for retaining what they consider to be an anthropocentric bias. Dark greens are environmentalists who believe that human beings are taking too much of the earth up. They believe that wilderness areas need to be expanded to allow the return of apex species like grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves. People like Edward Abbey and Dave Foreman again argue that we need the big outside in order to survive ourselves as a species. We need ecodiversity. The dark green perspective is easily prone to radicalization, and a number of eco-terrorist groups have formed that were guided by what might be characterized as a dark green ethos. Earth First and the Sea Shepherd Society have adopted militant approaches to environmental protection, engaging in ecotage and the spiking of old-growth timber, and ramming whaling vessels in the instance of the Sea Shepherd Society. So hopefully these two mini lectures will provide us with a good starting point. Certainly there is plenty to discuss. Let's have a productive week.